Yeah. Colin, let's get started with the current phase of the conflict right now in the Middle East. Before we talk about what's going on, let's just see what Washington is talking about in terms of how Iran have to respond, how Iran has to respond to Israel.
Matt, in your response to Olivia and to Simon, as a matter of fact, you urged the Iranians it's not in their interest to respond and so on. But at least, do they have the right to respond? I mean, is that part of self-defense?
So as I just answered that question.
I just want to, on the issue of self-defense.
I just answered that question in response to what I got from Simon. A right is one thing.
Right.
Taking steps that are productive and are conducive to the interests of their people, that are conducive to the interests of the broader region, are another question. And in no way would a retaliatory action by Iran in any way serve the interests of the Iranian people or the broader region.
And that's precisely why I'm asking you, because you mentioned the word right. So you are acknowledging that they do have the right to respond.
No, I did not acknowledge that.
Okay.
I acknowledged the question.
Okay, then let me ask you, if this was, let's say, happened in any of the Western capitals, wouldn't they be sort of obligated to respond?
I'm not going to deal with a hypothetical.
Okay, all right. We'll deal with something real. Last week, a week ago, yesterday, Sunday, an Iran rocket hit, or maybe intentional, hit a small town of Majid al-Shams, a Syrian town, Syrian citizens, and so on. And you said that Israel had a right to defend itself. I'm not you personally, but I'm saying, so what's different? I mean, everybody was, everyone was saying Israel has a right to defend itself. Why doesn't Iran have a right to itself when the guest house, I don't want to make comparisons, but it's like the guest house in London or maybe Blair House or anything. I mean, something that really touched the sovereignty of Iran.
So I take the point of your question, Saeed. It is not in any way, however, useful at all for anyone in the region for Iran to consider taking such steps because of the risk, as I said, that this could potentially get out of control. And that's the message we will.
Yeah. Can we understand what they're talking about in Washington and what would be productive for the conflict right now in the Middle East?
I think the question is the essence of the question is what is the purpose of Israel attacking Iran, and B, what's the purpose for Iran to respond? Let's use the word respond rather than retaliate. The thing is that in the answer of the State Department, it's true that in the situation of today, if Iran responds to Israel, it's not self-defense as such, technically speaking. But the problem is a little bit different. Iran tried to keep away from this conflict, in fact. From the very beginning, the Israelis tried to convince the rest of the world that Iran was at the source of this offensive of Hamas on the 7th of October 2023. But soon after that, by the way, interestingly, both the American and the Israeli intelligence services denied that Iran was involved in the design and in the launching of that operation. So, but we see that on a political side, there was a clear intent from the Israeli to give another dimension to the Hamas operation. Later, and especially in April this year, as Israel attacked the consulate of the Iranian consulate in Damascus, the Iran felt obliged to respond, and for a simple reason, is that the problem is that Israel wants to extend this war because Israel wants, as it has always done, it tries to have the US involved physically, militarily, and physically in this conflict. Now, the idea of involving Iran is behind is in fact the reason for that. Now, Iran tried to respond very wisely by providing a show of force, very precise, very calibrated, in order to attack military objectives, avoiding civilian casualties, and demonstrating its capacity to saturate Israeli air defense while still reaching limited military objectives. And the purpose of that response was, in fact, dissuasion. It was a deterrent, in fact. Now, with this later attack on Ismail Haniyeh by Israel, we see that Israel tries to go a step forward in a possible escalation, both by killing probably one of the most moderate Hamas leader who was involved in the discussions and negotiations with Qatar and the U.S. By the way, on the issue of a possible ceasefire and hostage release and so on and so forth. So first of all, Israel wants to kill this guy who is knowingly a moderate. And secondly, Israel attacks on purpose the Ismail Haniyeh on the Iranian territory. So normally Haniyeh is based in Qatar, and most probably the Israelis know or have probably an opportunity to know where he stays exactly and so on. But they decided to attack on Iranian territory. I think, and I'm not the only one to think that it is definitely on purpose. The idea was definitely to drag Iran into a situation where Iran had and has to respond. Now, the problem for Iran is the following: is that if they don't respond, that means there will be something else coming from Israel, because Israel wants this conflict. They want to have an extension of the conflict. They want to have, especially because they don't have, I mean, Netanyahu, the current government, doesn't have any success in Gaza. They have additional problems in the West Bank. They have problems on the northern border. They just had this problem in the Golan. And we see that, and not even mentioning the international scene, where Israel is obviously more and more isolated. We have these attacks from the Houthis, uh, nota bene attacks that have not been uh, let's say, suppressed by both the Brits or the Americans. So, meaning that nobody has been able to silence the Houthis, and even more, the Houthis were able to fly up to Israel, up to Tel Aviv, to attack Tel Aviv, meaning that Israel is in always more uncomfortable situation on the international scene. It has less and less political support, especially from the US. I mean, from the US population rather than the US establishment. And by the way, that's the reason why Netanyahu had to go to Washington, D.C., in order to make sure that the establishment keeps supporting the Israel, because the situation, especially in the presidential election year, you may have a shift in the mood of the U.S. and the Americans, the American population, as to how and to what extent support Israel. As a result, Israel feels more and more isolated, meaning that in order to restore some kind of unity around itself, it needs to have an involvement from, let's say, a physical involvement from the West and especially the US. And that for that reason, Israel needs to have this, let's say, a more important confrontation in the region that involves notably Iran, maybe Syria, and so on. And that's the context, meaning that Iran knows perfectly that if they don't respond, they will have more provocation and even more Israeli action. And remember, it's not the first time that Israel conducts terrorist activities in Iran, that Israel has already made various assassination operation against scientists, against political leaders, and has always not always, but has also involved some tribes, especially in the southern part of the country and in the northern part of the country, with the help, and that needs to be mentioned also, with the help of the US. In any case, uh, Iran knows that if they don't respond, if they don't show their willingness to fight, Israel will take advantage of the situation. So any response from Iran is not stricto sensu, in a strict sense, is not a defense, but it's more like deterrence in order to indicate to Israel that they are ready to defend themselves. And that's why we are in a very peculiar situation where Iran must or feels that it must give let's say, a strong response to Israel action, because they also know that Israel will not stay without doing anything if there is no response. So and the US knows that perfectly. And in addition to that, what Iran noticed is that US has no control over Israel. And that's also very important. Although the we have seen in the whole crisis, and it's not new, but it was blatant after the 7th of October, that the only Western actor that is able to dialogue and to influence, or would be able to influence Israel, are the United States. But experience shows that the US are not able to convince Israel to calm down a little bit, to moderate itself, to respond in a more moderate manner, especially as regard to the civilians, and so on and so forth. In other words, the Iranians, as others in the region, by the way, have understood that Israel, sorry, is a loose cannon somehow, and there is absolutely no influence whatsoever from the United States. And as an example for that, I just said that, and you remember, because we have mentioned that on your channel, that Netanyahu was in Washington D.C. and apparently, not apparently, I mean, Netanyahu met Joe Biden, but apparently Netanyahu didn't mention the attack against Haniyeh. And one can assume that this was a complex operation, and this operation was very surely planned and probably already in the implementation stage as Netanyahu was in Washington, D.C. But Netanyahu decided not to talk about it to Joe Biden, probably not in order to avoid that Joe Biden say no. The fact of the matter is that in this year, of the presidential election in the U.S., the Democrat, and I mean it's no longer Joe Biden, now it's Kamala Harris, but it is not in a very easy position, because the initiatives, the US initiatives, both in the Middle East and in Ukraine, are turned into failures. And for that reason, the Biden administration was looking to have some kind of success in pressing Israel in negotiation with the Hamas in order to have some kind of ceasefire and a release of hostages, which could be to the credit of the US diplomacy. But apparently, this will not work. The US understands that. And if Netanyahu had asked to Biden, not asked, but had informed Joe Biden that it was planning an operation against Haniyeh in Tehran, most probably Joe Biden would probably have expressed some veto on that. And for that reason, Netanyahu didn't even mention that to Joe Biden. And apparently, after this assassination, there was some phone call between Joe Biden and Netanyahu, and apparently the US was very unhappy about this evolution because it ruins every effort to have some kind of dialogue in this between Israel and the Palestinian, and of course, no success that could be credited to the US diplomacy in this context. So that means that Israel acts as a loose cannon, doesn't listen to the US. Remember that as the US in the Security Council announced that they were ready to support a ceasefire, the US ambassador was just a few minutes later contradicted by the Israeli ambassador, who said, well, we don't care about what they decide in terms of ceasefire. We don't want to talk to the Hamas, period. We don't want to negotiate. So that was certainly a slap to on the face of the U.S. ambassador, but that shows that Israel in this conflict doesn't consider any type of advice from outside, despite the fact that the only one who could provide such an, let's say, an advice could be the US, meaning that the influence of the US has reduced considerably. So Iran understands that. So that means that they are on their own to solve the crisis, and in order to prevent Israel continuing to make such kind of provocation, even to increase the level of provocation, Iran has to respond very strongly. But again, as we had in April when Iran was in a similar situation, and you remember that between the attack on the consulate of the Iranian consulate in Damascus and the Iranian response, we had something like 12 days. During these 12 days, the Iranian diplomacy connected with both the US, Qatar, Yemen, and Turkey in order to have to explain that they didn't want to launch all-out war against Israel, and they wanted to make sure that if they give, let's say, moderate but calibrated response, the U.S. would not intervene in the conflict. And now they are exactly in the same situation, and probably an even more acute situation. And that's probably the reason why Iran has called the Conference of the Islamic Cooperation to meet. I think they will meet tomorrow, Wednesday, to have to discuss the matter. And uh, probably Iran will make some proposal or receive the advice from other Islamic countries to see if what kind of support, I mean political support, it can get from these countries, and how they will react towards the US in case of an enlargement or an extension of the conflict, if you have the involvement of some Western countries. So We see that Iran has a very cautious approach to the response. It's not self defense per se, but it's a way to show, it's a kind of show of force, and probably a little bit with a very stronger message today, in order to avoid that Israel starts a deliberate escalation in the area. So, in this context, we also have to consider that the former the Russian former defense minister, Mr. Shoigu, is currently in Iran to discuss matter related to the military cooperation agreement they signed recently. Both countries signed together, which is, and that's very important. It's not a security agreement; it's a military cooperation agreement. It means that it relates much more to military industrial complex type of cooperation, training, and this kind of provision of some equipment and so on and so forth. Some have reported that apparently the Russia, sorry, has delivered to Iran electronic warfare equipment, the Murmansk BN, which is an extremely powerful electronic warfare equipment that can jam communication at quite an extended range. I have seen various figures, but honestly, I'm so impressed by the distance that I'm not sure it's real. So I will not mention any figure, but apparently it's an extremely powerful system that has been deployed in certain areas in Russia and in Crimea. In any case, that means that Russia will certainly not have operational support to Iran, but it may provide equipment and technology to help Iran solving the situation, or helping the Iranian forces to avoid damage. So so we are in this situation where Iran is exploring the different paths for responding. They have a very narrow path, in fact, because the whole issue is how to give a message to Israel which is powerful enough to deter Israel to escalate the conflict, and at the same time to have a message which is not too powerful in order to prevent the involvement of the US in the conflict, and to create or generate a regional conflict that would involve more countries in the than just the two, Israel and Iran. We have seen that after the killing of Haniyeh, the Saudi Arabia has apparently sent a letter of condolence to Tehran, and so meaning that, and that's an interesting reaction from Saudi Arabia, because it materialized what we have seen already last year. That means this rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and shows that despite the, let's say, this conflict or religious conflict that was alleged, especially in the West, despite this, the relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia are good. Um, Even if Saudi Arabia may be, let's say, may oppose the use of its airspace to allow Iranian missiles to strike Israel. And but it's also interesting to show to understand the reason for that. By the way, Jordan has stated the same. They asked Iran not to use, or I should say, I should formulate that differently. They said that they would not allow Iranian missile to overfly their territory. And the reason they invoke for that is that they want to protect themselves. And that's interesting. I mean, this reason is very interesting because both Saudi Arabia, and especially Jordan, are afraid of the Israeli reaction. So we have in the region, let's say, a relationship which is in fact very much mafia-like type. That means that Israel is not, it has no friends, but it imposes itself to the other by the threat of using force. And for that's especially true for Jordan, because it's a country that has a very important Palestinian population. By the way, Jordan used to be part of Palestine. I mean, the mandatory Palestine that was under the British rule after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And Jordan is today called Jordan, but it used to be the Transjordan, and that was as such part of Palestine. And for you may or may not know that the political party, the Likud, and this very extremist branch of the Likud, from which Netanyahu comes, by the way, is a branch that still claims that Palestine should be, I mean, the whole of Palestine should be part of Israel. So, meaning that from a Jordan point of view, they fear that Israel may or might want to attack Jordan at one point. And Jordan is a country which is, despite the fact it has a very good army, I have been recently in Jordan and in contact with Jordan military. They have very good and dedicated army, but it's not a very powerful army. And it's not, Jordan is a rather a peaceful country that doesn't want to engage into a conflict, and they are a little bit afraid of possible Israeli reaction in the case that Jordan would facilitate the Iranian response against Israel. So we see in through this situation, we see that Israel has imposed itself in the region, not through skilled diplomacy and good friendly relationship with its neighbors, but through the threat of use of force. And we are in this situation, and that's, for me, it's not a situation that could be sustained in the long term. I have the feeling that the situation that Israel has created by killing Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran is a situation that has not been, let's say, that the rest of the Arab world has not accepted as such, even if they don't want to engage Israel in a conflict. At the same time, I'm not sure that Israel gets a lot of support around this operation. And in the case the situation would evolve into a regional conflict, um, I'm not sure this would be in advantage of Israel. And that's probably the reason why such a situation would probably inevitably require the intervention and the commitment of the US into the conflict. So we are in a very tense, well, that's obvious, it's a very tense situation, but we're also in a very delicate situation where Iran has to calibrate extremely carefully the level of its response. And um, this is a situation that is, again, will probably be smarter after the conference of the Islamic states, because then we'll probably know better what is the reaction of the conference of the Islamic State, and what they are ready to accept from Iran as an acceptable type of, I mean, or acceptable level of response.
Do you think that right now, this conflict in Gaza and right after the consequences of this conflict, the assassinations that are happening right now, and how these type of policies, this unconditional support of the United States going to Israel is going to change the future of Middle East? Because it seems that even you mentioned that Saudi Arabia and Jordan are afraid of Israel right now. The only upper hand Israel has is nuclear bombs. And even the United States, everybody in that region afraid of the United States because of nuclear bombs. And how this idea, how this type of policy going to change the future of Middle East? Are they going to go after nuclear bombs?
Well, this is the unknown factor. The situation would be easier if Iran had nuclear weapons, but it most probably doesn't have nuclear weapons. And therefore, if you have the use of nuclear weapons in the Middle East, this will be from Israel. But in this situation, I would bet that, because nuclear weapons, they are obviously terrifying weapons, but they are not absolute weapons. They might destroy part of a city. I mean, if you see the pictures of Hiroshima, we have to consider that Hiroshima was a very a special type of construction, and with wood and paper and this kind of thing that helped the city to be easily destroyed, as we see on these the pictures of 1945. Using nuclear bombs on a more modern city with concrete construction and things like that would probably not have exactly the same, or would not bring the same level of destruction. But nevertheless, it's a political signal. But the point is that Israel will not be able to destroy a nation as big as Iran just with nuclear weapons. Even if Israel use 100, I mean, his 100 or 200 or 300 um, a nuclear warhead, that will not be sufficient to destroy the Iranian nation. And once Israel has launched its warhead, what's left? Not much. But then Israel, in my view, would be considered really as a rogue state by everybody. And I'm not sure that anybody would be then willing to assist Israel, and then we could have the end of Israel, I think. That's what I think, because again, nuclear weapons are terrible, going to bring a lot of distraction, but it cannot destroy a nation, and especially not a big nation. And by the way, remember that with this conflict in Gaza, as I said before, Israel has not been able to, let's say, get a lot of support on the international stage at strategic level. I mean, uh, Israel has fought a war at tactical level, not even operational. It's a tactical war, but at strategic level, it has definitely lost. It may have the illusion of a support because, especially in the US, as we discussed before with this address from Benjamin Netanyahu to the Congress in Washington, D.C., the Israeli may have the illusion of a support because if you just consider US and probably Western elite at large, the small tip of the pyramid that you have in Western countries, including the US, you have in this context, you may have a support to Israel. And that's very true in the US, where the support to Israel is bipartisan, clearly. And that was demonstrated, by the way, during the Netanyahu address. But I'm not sure that the populations, and that's certainly the case in Europe and certainly the case in the US, that the population don't agree with their own elites on this matter. And you have a discrepancy between what the elites think about Israel and what the population, the general population, think about Israel. Meaning that the support that Israel enjoys today is a political one. It's a support provided by the leadership. I'm not sure it's a support that is widely supported by the Western population at large, both in Europe and in the US. As a result, if Israel uh, decides to launch nuclear bombs on the Iranian population, that will certainly satisfy people like Lindsey Graham and others who have advocated the total destruction of Iran, and others, by the way, including the assassination of individuals. But I'm not sure the population will, the public opinion will accept that, and that will play a big role if the conflict would involve into a nuclear one, and that will certainly be not accepted by the populations of the Middle East, and then we might have uh, countries that might become more aggressive towards Israel. And you can use your nuclear bombs in against, let's say, big cities in Iran or somewhere else in the Middle East. But if you assume that you have thousands, hundreds of thousands of military or Arab armies attacking on the territory on Israel, Israel will not be able to use its nuclear bomb on its own territory because then it will destroy its own population and the own rationale for existing. And that might well be how things happen. Because if Israel decides to start with nuclear weapons, that would probably trigger other kind of reaction in the Middle East, and people will be disinhibited to attack on the territory of Israel. Because so far, remember, even when we talk about Hezbollah and all that, none of these countries have claims over the Israel territory. It's true for the Palestinian resistance because they are fighting for the same territory as Israel does, if you want. But both Hezbollah, Iran, and others, they have no claims over the Israeli territory. So basically, there is for them there is no reason to enter the Israeli territory. But if Israel threatens to use nuclear weapons and start bombing around cities with nuclear bomb, then you might have then an incentive for Arabic countries not to have a claim over Israel, but to have the idea of simply destroying Israel because it's a country that has not been able since 1948 to integrate itself into the Near East community, that has never managed to being, let's say, involved and to be part of this Near Eastern community. Uh, Israel imposed its presence by force, by the threat of using more force, and that's the kind of relationship it has with its neighbors. Remember that even the so-called Abraham Accords that were sponsored by the US with Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates. Even these Abraham Accords were, in fact, more or less imposed by the US to some extent. And the US had to make some concessions, like, for instance, the Western Sahara for Morocco, and so on and so forth, in order to force these countries in accepting this treaty. But we have seen after the 7th of October that all these Arabic countries are not so keen to normalize their relationships with Israel, because Israel on its side has never make any effort to have a normalized relationship with other Arab countries. So I think the use of nuclear weapons, though possible by Israel, especially if Israel feels that its mere existence is threatened by Iran, which personally I think that Iran has no willingness to erase Israel, and has probably not even the means to erase Israel from the region. But that might be the perception of the Israelis. But even in this situation, if Israel starts to engage into a nuclear war, that would be definitely the end of Israel. That's what I can feel. And by the way, remember that even Erdogan just said a few days ago that he was ready to invade Israel. So we see that this idea of having, let's say, an invasion of Israel is not very far away. And I'm very surprised and astonished to see that the Israelis have not understood that, and that they have not decided to address the problem by through the more diplomatic initiatives, because that's definitely not what the Netanyahu government is showing at this stage. On the contrary, it decides to exacerbate the situation rather to calm it down and concentrate on the solution with the Palestinian population. So we are in a situation which is extremely disturbing, because from the Israeli side there is an obvious intent to escalate the situation and not to use the path of diplomacy to find, let's say, to calm down the overall situation. And that might well be the end of Israel, because remember, and that's, by the way, the first sentence of my book on the operation to fund Al Aqsa, this operation Al Aqsa flood. Um, this a quote from the Guardian, the British paper, that says, if we are not careful, we might well be see the end and the destruction of Israel, and that's an eventuality that may become true.
Don't you think that it's time to the European Union, whoever is the decision makers in the European Union, to think of Israel as, because they have been influenced by these endless wars, endless conflicts in the Middle East directly, and how they can do in order to convince the United States that this policy is not working. Right now, we have many problems in Europe, and
Well,
Yeah, sorry.
But the
Yes, no,
question, the main question is, what leverage the European Union has to put any sort of pressure on Israel or on the United States?
the short answer is none. The short answer is none. By the way, as we discuss both the question of Ukraine, by the way, and the Palestine, we see that each time everybody turns to the US. Um, uh, Even if the US seems in both situations to be rather powerless, but I mean, it has some influence, but not an influence that may help to solve the problem in a satisfactory way for both actors on both conflict. In any case, when we address the question of Palestine, and that's not new, by the way, that's not just since the 7th of October, but Europe has never been a real actor in that. You had, at some point, you had some individual countries, especially France, um, that, especially, let's say, 30 years ago, something like that, France still had some kind of leverage and could have an influence, probably not just over Israel, but also over the Arabic states, because it had good relations on both sides. But today, France diplomacy is inexistent, is inexperienced, and has demonstrated its inability to solve issue. And that's very true for the European diplomacy. European diplomacy is inexistent in the Ukrainian conflict, with the exception of providing weapons and providing more, putting more gasoline on the fire. For that, the diplomacy is very good. And remember that they just nominated Mrs. Kaya Kallas, the head of the European diplomacy, and Kaya Kallas is from Estonia, a strong anti-Russian, and Baltic states have very little experience of the Middle East, if none, and no interest for the Middle East, absolutely zero interest. So how can we expect from the European Union, which was already quite weak under Josep Borrell, who used to be the head of the European Union foreign policy or external service. Um, so Josep Borrell was very poor, had a very poor results in this conflict. So how can we expect Kaya Kallas to do better? I think it's hopeless. The European Union is certainly not considered as a serious interlocutor by neither of the parties, neither from Iran and from Arab countries, neither from Israel. So forget about European Union. And in addition to that, we can see in European Union some kind of suicidal type of behavior. Just note that very recently, that's a German word, sorry, Signora Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, decided to resume diplomatic relationships with Syria, with the idea that in order to prevent or to limit the extension of immigration, it would be probably more interesting to have good relation with Syria. And some other countries of Europe were favorable to this idea, and some countries have even signed a letter to the European Commission in order to promote the idea of resuming diplomatic relations with Syria and opening a Syrian embassy in the European Union. But it's very interesting to see that from the European Union itself, you had a very strong negative reaction to that. Even though the purpose of resuming diplomatic relations, as I said, had as a purpose to reduce illegal immigration, which is obviously a problem that we have seen in particular in Sweden and right now in the UK, by the way, to see that all this immigration that, because remember that the bulk of this immigration that came just after 2015, after the US and the British, the French, and the Belgian decided to fight more aggressively the Islamic State in Iraq, not in Syria, but in Iraq, and that had as a consequence that a lot of those extreme Islamist fighters who were, I mean, they were not really fighting for something. They were fighting the regime of Bashar al-Assad, but I'm not sure they were very convinced about the necessity of this fight. As a result, as soon as they had the opportunity to leave Syria and to get the status of refugee in Europe, they did so. As a result, the refugees that Europe got just after 2015, in fact, were mostly Islamists in reality. And for that reason, by the way, as they came in Syria, and not if you looked at the profile of those who came to Europe during those years, 2016, 2015, 16, 17, they were all young males that, in fact, tried to escape the U.S. and French bombing in Iraq and partially in Syria, because even though the Western armies didn't fight the Islamic State in Syria as such, I mean, they never fought against the Islamic State when the Islamic State was confronting Syrian army. They fought against the Islamic State when the Islamic State was confronting the Kurds. And in fact, the Western Air Force and armies and special force and all that acted in support of the Kurds, and therefore used to fight very selectively the Islamic State in the Kurds area, but not in the western part of Syria. As a result, a lot of young Syrians, or let's say Sunni, who wanted to avoid those bombing, they came to Europe. So Europe didn't receive a very strong elite. There were people who were ready to fight and all that, and as they didn't get what they hoped to get in the West, well, they started to make some disorder. And that's very true in Sweden. And Sweden has a very strong problem with immigration, because the type of immigration Sweden accepted was the worst type of immigration. I mean, that was the worst choice that they could have, but they did that on their own. They were their intelligence service is notably weak in terms of analysis, and that's exactly the result for Sweden. So, and in UK, the history is not very different. Is a little bit. It's probably traced back longer in time. So it's something that traced back to the Iraqi war in 2003 and so on. So, but it's a similar situation. Those people who came to Europe were not the best educated people, the best people, and so on and so forth. And as a result, uh, they um, uh, they are keen to create a trouble, and if they were, and the policies of the European countries were such that they never tried or they never managed to integrate those people. As a result, European Union could have an interest in having good relationship with Bashar al-Assad in order to prevent this flow of immigration coming from Syria, and to facilitate the return of these refugees to Syria. But even that, the European Commission is not willing to do so. So we have a very strange relationship, strange reaction in Europe, and I'm not sure that the Europeans have understood exactly what is going on, and they haven't really understood what is at stake, both in the Middle East and even in their own countries, by the way. So. Um, at the end of the day, we it's a little bit desperate, but because today, as we see today, the European Union is putting some pressure on Mrs. Meloni and other countries who are like-minded in order to ease relationship with Syria. So we are definitely not from if we look at the European foreign policy, we are definitely not in a situation where the Europeans are willing to ease the situation. In my view, they are more pouring more gasoline on the fire, and they are more creating more problems for the future. But again, it's very hard to understand the rationale which is behind those strange decisions, and the lack of understanding what is at stake in the mid and long term, because that's the problem.
Yeah, when it comes right now to the conflict in Ukraine, in your opinion, what's going on there? We've seen that the United States sent F-16s to Ukraine, and right now it seems that Russia is advancing. And how do you find it right now? Do you think that is it going Russia to define it, and we're gonna stop here and we're not gonna advance anymore, or is the United States has to decide that it's enough for Ukraine? Let's go after some sort of political settlement.
Definitely, as we talk about Ukraine, the US was the one who set fire to the problem. And the US were definitely those who started the problem. That's definitely true. But I think that the US is also the country that has understood that the war is lost for the West. And that's, in my view, they have understood that already by the end of 2022. Problem at this stage is probably the European Union again. I'm not sure that the Europeans have understood exactly what is at stake, uh, because, first of all, the US, despite the fact that they understood that it was a lost cause for Ukraine, they kept uh, providing weapons and support and political support also to Ukraine, and this will probably continue so. But probably the view of the US is to have a situation that calms down. The Europeans are still living on some kind of wishful thinking in terms of the conflict. Um, I am not sure exactly where those 6 or 8 F-16 are coming from. Some say they are coming from the Netherlands. It's not clear exactly where they come from, but this is what is sure is that the arrival of these F-16 will definitely not change anything on the situation on the ground. And in my view, they must be seen as more a PR operation rather than a definite change in operational capabilities. It's a way for Zelensky to show that it has the support of the West. It's it's a tangible demonstration of the Western support, if you want. It's something that can be demonstrated, and in that sense, it's the arrival of those fighters is important for Zelensky. But Remember that there are only 6 to 8. They might other fighters may come in near future. The number of pilots is very limited. Recently, have seen a report saying that they have only six pilots being formed in the West. I think that was mentioned by the Telegraph or something like that. There is even a report from the Romanian Defense Ministry saying that Romania has been able to form only 3 pilots, and apparently the 50 other pilots who were supposed to be trained by Romania, they didn't show any willingness to be qualified for fighting. And apparently, those pilots would prefer to stay in the West rather than going back to fight in Ukraine. So we have a situation where, despite having 6 or 8 or maybe more F-16, they might not be able to fly those F-16, and might even not be able to have the skills to fight with those F-16. In addition to that, remember that, for instance, if we assume that these F-16 were provided by the Netherlands, and Belgium, for instance, has also promised or pledged to provide F-16. But remember that those F-16 were in fact to be liquidated in order to accommodate for Belgium and Netherlands to receive the F-35, meaning that for the Western armies, these are obsolete fighters. So even though they might have got some slight improvements in the recent months or weeks, these fighters are basically from an older generation as the fighters that Russia can fly. And essentially, these equipment, uh, they might not been technically and technologically been able to fight on equal foot the Russian fighters. In addition to that, the Russian pilots have probably more experience. I mean, they have been committed for 2 years now in Ukraine, so they probably have more experience, battle experience, and so on. That the Ukrainians, who are apparently very young, because what I've seen from the report from the Romanian Ministry of Defense, these are pilots aged between 21 and 23, so extremely young guys with little battle experience, if none. So we even these as I said, the importance of this F-16 is more political than operational. But this gives the Russians an opportunity to have a more offensive rhetoric. And for the Russians, as long as the West continues to provide weapons, even if those weapons are obsolete or might not be at the technological level that could match with the Russian equipment, even if it's not that kind of equipment, the Russian will consider that the support to Ukraine is in fact a way to support the continuation of the conflict. As I said previously on this channel, this conflict can only end in 3 ways: the decisive defeat of Ukraine and the decisive victory, the decisive defeat of Russia and the decisive victory of Ukraine. And everybody understands as of today that this possible end is very unlikely. The second is a negotiation to resume a dialogue and negotiated solution, as we were about to have in March, April 2022, before the intervention of Boris Johnson. So that's the second option, which, in my view, would be the solution that would provide both Russia and Ukraine with the best chances of, let's say, having a future. And the next solution is in my view, the worst one is that the West continues to provide incentives for Ukraine to continue fighting, but given the superiority of the Russian forces and the superiority in terms of equipment, personnel, uh, um, strategic reserves, and so on and so forth, I would say that this option is conducive to the end of Ukraine as we know it. That means the destruction or incapacitation of the state of Ukraine to function, the total destruction of the armed forces, and eventually the end of Ukraine as an independent state. And the fact that the West is uh, pressing Ukraine to continue to fight means that we are heading towards this third situation. My view is that the Russians are not aiming at taking over the whole of Ukraine. As I've said many times, they know that the western part of Ukraine is extremely nationalistic, will continue to fight in some kind of resistance fight, as it happened after World War II, and the ultra nationalist movement under Stepan Bandera before he was assassinated in 1960 or 61. Um, the Ukrainians or the western part of Ukraine may continue to fight some kind of guerrilla war in this part of Ukraine, meaning that an occupation of western Ukraine is probably not what Russia is aiming at. But Russia might continue occupy the Russian or the Russian speaking parts of Ukraine. That means in essence that would be up to the Dnieper River uh, from the east and the south, and probably in addition to that the Odessa oblast, the oblast of or the Odessa region, that might also, which is in majority Russian-speaking region. So that might what Russia might want to occupy, but then Ukraine is a country that has no real future because it would have no access to the sea. It would have lost most of the part of the territory which is the richest part of the territory, the most industrialized part of the territory, the part of the territory that used to support economically Ukraine. And that, by the way, that's the reason why the Donbass was artificially added to Ukraine during the Soviet times, because the idea was to provide Ukraine with some industrial capabilities and capacities, and that's the historic reason for a Soviet Union to add the Donbass to Ukraine in order to have a country that can sustain itself, if you want, to some extent. Now, Ukraine has lost the Donbass, may lost all its access to sea, and as I said, most of its industrial capabilities and capacities, modern capabilities. And therefore, we are probably, thanks to the Europeans, we are probably witnessing now the end of Ukraine slowly. Without, I'm not even mentioning the fact that you may have some bordering or neighboring countries such as Poland, Hungary, and Romania who might want to get their part of territory, which used to be or to belong. I mean, the used to these parts that used to belong to those territory, like Transcarpathia for Ukraine and Galicia for Poland, and so on and so forth. So, and some have suggested, I don't know if it is in the plans of these countries to retake these regions. But that's a scenario that has been mentioned by several experts. I have no indication that Poland, Hungary, and Romania would like to recover their this territorial integrity by taking over this region, but that might happen. So we see that the future of Ukraine is very dim, and it's interesting. Again, you could ask exactly the same question as the one we have towards the Middle East and Syria and all that. European Union has not been able to understand what is at stake and what could be the future evolution. They are the European Union is stuck in their narrative, in this kind of wishful thinking that considers that Ukraine can afford and can reach some kind of victory, although nobody has been able to define what could be a victory, given the fact that it's very unlikely that the Ukrainian forces can recover and retake all the territory they have lost since February 2022. So the European Union is somehow dreaming about a solution that is very unlikely. And the problem is that this dream is at the cost of the Ukrainian population and Ukrainian forces. You have more and more military and soldiers and who try to escape the battlefield, try to escape towards Romania, try to avoid being drafted into the conflict. So I'm not sure the European leadership has a clear understanding of what's going on in Ukraine. Uh, as a paradox, I think the US has a better understanding of what is at stake. And and that's interesting that in this conflict, although the US was more or less the cause of the conflict, it might well be the only way of getting out of this conflict. This is very strange, but despite the very, let's say, ineffective diplomacy of the US in the last 2 years, both in Palestine and in Ukraine, the Europeans didn't even try to take over and to have some kind of let's say try to get more importance in terms of diplomatic influence in the region. So I'm not sure about how the European leaders, both at European Union level and in individual countries, understand the situation. In my view, here there is a problem which is both a problem of ideology. They are definitely um, entangled in their ideology, but there might also be some kind of intellectual limitation. I'm not sure these leaders, and that's probably the reason why they are so strongly contested in every country, because they don't have the intellectual capability to understand what is at stake. That's my concern, in fact.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being with us today. Great
That was
pleasure
my
as always.
that was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
See you
Thank
soon.
you. Bye bye. See you.
Bye bye.